Hi there, and welcome to Next Frontier. My name is Thomas Anderson, founder and CEO of Responsibly, and Next Frontier is my show about sustainability in the supply chain. Today, I'm talking to Neil D'Souza. Neil is the CEO of Makersite, a fast-growing, well-funded scale-up dedicated to helping companies design sustainable products. Neil is also an engineer, and you can really feel that in his extremely logical and pragmatic way to approaching the topics that we discuss. So I think there's a lot of takeaways in just that. We discuss everything related to product design, and we approach it pretty much using the cradle to grave methodology. Don't be scared of that word. It basically means we first look at the upstream of a product, so the supply chain, and what you can do to make that more sustainable. That means we discuss localization, we discuss sustainable materials, and a big part of the discussion is how do you go beyond your first level of suppliers, your direct suppliers. That's a problem that I don't really think has been solved yet, but Neil disagrees a little bit, and he has some very, very interesting points. The second part of the discussion is how do you go downstream, i.e. how do you improve your product's end-of-life performance? And here Neil has some really interesting points about contextualizing your decisions to the actual places your product gets consumed. Okay, Neil D'Souza, CEO of Makersite. Here we go. Hey Neil.
Hey Thomas, how are you?
It's good to see you. I'm very well, thank you. How are you doing?
Also good. It's a good day.
That's good to hear. I'm still licking my wounds a little bit today. I was at a concert yesterday, and I think that was the worst concert performance I've ever had. The artist showed up like 3 hours late, and when we have a babysitter on, that's not good, right? Because you're constantly worrying about when you have to go back home. So that was a little bit of a disappointment, but today has been pretty good business-wise, so that's always nice.
At least you're fresh.
At least, well.
Usually the consequence of concerts is the next day you suffer for it, right? So.
That's true, but honestly, Neil, I think you have a few years on me, right? But I'm already at the point where, just getting home at like past midnight and having to go up to work next day. I feel it, man. It's not what it used to be.
Yes, it sucks, and it only gets worse. I can tell you.
It only gets worse. Oh no. Yeah, it all goes downhill from here, doesn't it?
Yes, 35 was my peak.
35. Okay, that's good. So I'm not there yet, Neil. So I still have a peak ahead of me. That's good.
That's it.
Awesome. Where are you sitting today, Neil?
I'm in our office in Stuttgart. Actually, we have a couple of people that just joined us. We hired a new CTO of the company, a new director of engineering of data, and these two are around getting onboarded. And it's a big thing for a company like us to have when you hire an external CTO, right? It's not just about the seniority that you bring into the company and the experience you bring to the company, but it's also on the other hand side. It's a shift. I've been the technical soul of the company for a very long time. And now I'm handing over the reins to someone else, and it's a big jump.
That's exciting. How does that feel? Are you a little bit nervous about handing over the control?
The baby, yeah. That's let's just put it differently. I will use this as practice for when it happens with my two daughters, right? So.
That's interesting. Probably a lot of similarities that can be drawn there when it comes to it.
Yes.
Fantastic. Well, Neil, I'm super happy to have you here. So a big welcome to Next Frontier.
Thanks very much for having me, Thomas.
Absolutely. And there's so much I want to talk with you about today. So let's see if we get to all of it. I've been following Makersite for a while. I think you guys have done an incredible job in helping companies essentially make more sustainable products, right? I'm using make there quite deliberately given your name. So I really want to pick your brain on all of that, right? I want to talk about, do's and don'ts. I want to talk about sustainable products, LCAs, sub-tier supplier data, all of that if we get there. But I'm also very curious, Neil, because I know a little bit about your background. How did you get into sustainability in the first place?
Wow, that's a long story, but I think it's it was by accident.
Okay.
When you're studying, I have done many things. I've done physics, I've done astrophysics, I've done space physics, I've done oceanography, geology, psychology, mathematics. There's many things that I exposed myself to in the
Wow.
early years, and then I had to make a choice at the end of what I want to do. And I was lucky. I was lucky to have a professor that kind of identified some of my strengths and interests and said, "This is what you should look into."
Hmm.
And so I started my interest in this field, in the field of climate physics, right, where we
Okay.
were trying to model how the activities we have an impact on the global circulation systems.
Hmm.
And I just loved it. The only problem was that it's great to understand what the impact is, but the goal is to change it. And I found a tiny company in the back end of Beyond in southern Germany, in Stuttgart, and they were doing something really curious.
Hmm.
They were helping companies understand supply chains. And if you think through this a bit, you understand that 100% of the impact you see in the world today comes from the products we make and use.
Hmm.
It's not about me driving a car or flying a plane. It's the plane and the car that are having an impact.
Hmm.
So the goal is to help those companies make better cars and planes and yogurt and spoons and laptops. And you get the idea.
Got it.
The big problem has been that in the last 40 years, we've globalized how we make stuff. We've
Hmm.
globalized our supply chains, and it's been good, right? You don't have to have expertise for every single component you make. You can outsource that to specialist companies, and it allowed us to make very complicated products very, very quickly.
Hmm.
The consequence of it has been that we don't know how they're made anymore. And so if you're at a cusp of wanting to change everything, the first step is reinventing or rediscovering how your own products are made. And this company was helping manufacturers do that. I found it, fell in love, and the rest is history.
That's awesome. Was that ThinkStep, the company you're talking about?
That was actually back then it was called PE, then it became PE International, then it became ThinkStep, and now it is Sphera.
Okay, so that's Sphera now, because Sphera I know, ThinkStep I had no idea who that is.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. So you joined that, I think, all the way back in 2008, right?
Yes, that's correct.
That must have been a different, atmosphere for sustainability. I mean, did you guys call it CSR back then almost?
CSR was one aspect of it. So there were even back then there were two big sustainability was divided into two big things. One
Hmm.
was corporate sustainability, where you would look at CSR as the big driver of investments and initiatives, and the other
Hmm.
was product sustainability, which was really LCA, right?
Got it.
And this was a company that, I mean, I was employee number 37, really early stage. Um, I think it was the cradle of a lot of the expertise. If you see, many of the experts have some link to this tiny company,
Hmm.
because it grew to almost 400 people at one point. And then, of course, it started speciating and the birds left the nest kind of. Um, but it was a great place to innovate. It was a great place for young people who were passionate about the environment to actually have an impact. And it was a big motivator for many people to join back in the day when I'd say the internal environment was still in that innovation phase, right? We were
Hmm.
discovering this new technology and developing it to help companies. Whereas on the outside, there wasn't such attention given to it, right? This mega trend of sustainability has been at the corner for the last 20 years,
Hmm.
and it's only just turned the corner. I would say in the last 2 to 3 years. So we were doing it before it was cool, and there were lots of
Yeah.
companies that trusted us to do this kind of work. It's great that now we're in a totally different world externally, right, where there is a lot more attention given to it. There's a lot more talent that has actually come to it as well, right? And I think this is what these two things combine. If you put enough energy, if you put enough fresh blood into anything, you cannot rip it back out. And I think that's where we are right now. A lot of movement that we've seen is a consequence of those early stage young. I call them. It's a combination of you need to be a bit of a romantic and a bit of a pirate to be in this space, right? And I think those pirates have now become CEOs of companies and CSOs of companies and are driving sustainability within organizations today.
No, that's great to hear. You know, I often talk with people who's been in the sustainability field for a lot longer than I have. And one of the unfortunate consequences sometimes is that you get a little bit pessimistic, you know, with history, right? You've been working in the field for a long time. You don't see change going that fast. You know, now you're like, why is this decade going to be any different from the last 3 decades or whatever? And, you know, with the benefit of ignorance coming into the field a little bit later, you know, as you say, the last 3 years have been game changing, right? So,
Yes.
you know, my experience have been completely different than probably your experience was in the beginning. But it's great to hear that you've stuck with it and that you haven't landed in kind of the pessimistic corner that I feel like some people almost struggle to avoid.
I think it's a bit of a character trait, right? You can pick people who have this trait. I mean, you would never be able to start a company if you were predisposed to being jaded. I call that being jaded, right? Where you look at something and you're like, oh, we've seen that before. Yeah, but the situation has changed.
Yeah.
And you need to be optimistic about that. Otherwise, those kind of people never start companies. And so I think it's a bit of a character trait that I have that I'm probably, you know, there's this, I think it was Steve Jobs who said, stay hungry, stay foolish, right? I think it's a character trait of I think that we share. And I think even 10 years from now, if nothing changes, I'm betting you will remain optimistic about it.
Yeah, 100%. I think you're right. And I think, you know, on that end, you just need a little bit of naivety if you
Yes.
want to create something new, right? If
Yes.
you understand the scope of what you're embarking on, you're probably never going to get started in the first place.
Exactly. I think that's it. That's it.
100%. Okay, so you know, beyond the pirates that are building these things and are maturing the kind of the ideas and the solution landscape a little bit, what do you think has made the world change? Why do you think the context is different today than it was 20 years ago?
I think it's a bit of maturity. If you think sustainability just makes sense, there is no logic against it. The only argument you can have is, well, it doesn't make financial sense. And what I've seen is that we've been calling it different things, trying to put lipstick on a pig kind of situation, right? We used to have energy efficiency, we used to have carbon trading, we used to have CSR, we used to have all of these different things that spoke about the same thing. They just found a different word for it. We then had ESG, and now nobody wants to talk of ESG anymore.
Yes.
I think you have to see the forest for the trees. It has always been building. There have been kind of dips, like we had financial crises. We had wars that kind of shifted attention. But I don't think there was ever a time where we turned away and we said, you know, this doesn't make any sense. We've always been progressing. I think what changed is there is it's almost like megatrends require other megatrends to succeed.
Okay.
So if you look at a couple of things, you have geopolitics that are very different today than they were many years ago, right? So there's the chip wars that started that principally said, hey, you know, there are certain supply chains that are extremely sensitive to the longevity and the sustainability of entire nations. And people started realizing we can't just depend on single sources where you're in unfriendly territories. And there were lots of situations where this happened: the Suez Canal, the COVID, the issues in South Korea.
Hmm.
I mean, there's or Singapore. There's tons of these examples where people started realizing something needs to change.
Yeah.
And so there started being this trend of what I call globalization, right, where it's still a globalized supply chain, but there are certain parts of the supply chain that become local. And you do this, the key parts need to come together.
Yeah.
Now, when you need to change the supply chain, everything needs to be reconsidered. And then one of the things is, hey, wouldn't we want to create something that is more sustainable?
Mm.
And this is one thing that added. I think the second is you have to think. Companies have realized in 2030. I'm not sure if this is common knowledge, right? But it is something that's quite startling. By 2030, 70% of buyers will be Gen Z and millennials.
Hmm.
This is 70% of buyers. That is a ridiculous portion of buyers that are more sensitive to sustainability and the climate impact that we're having from the products we make and use. There's lots of these studies that have been done in the past that have always tried to say, we think buyers would be willing to spend X much more to have more sustainable products. And everybody
Hmm.
used to say, let's wait and see. There's still lots of skeptics about that, but there was actually a study that was done by the Stern School Business School, and they track a portfolio of products over the last, I think it was a period of 10 years that they did, and they actually found that products that were that had claims, that made claims of being more sustainable, actually ended up growing faster and generating more revenue per unit for profitability for these companies.
Hmm.
And I think this is what companies have started realizing, that the buyers of today, very often cost sensitive, they're different. They grew up at a different time, right? You have to think post-war kind of adults. These are the main buyers, or have been the main buyers for the last 20 years. And this changes very fundamentally, very, very quickly.
Hmm.
I think the third big thing is regulation. We started this in Europe, and I think we talk a lot of circularity as an example, right? But if you think of why we're so interested in circularity in Europe, not so much in other places.
Hmm.
Why is that? It's simply because we're not mining raw materials anymore. All of this is done outside of our boundaries. So if we want to continue economic growth, but reduce the amount of risk that we have from the lack of availability of these precious materials, the only thing we can do is reuse as much as we can,
Hmm.
eliminate waste. And I think there's regulations that have been put in place that are I would say not the primary drivers, but a significant driver of sustainability adoption. That
Hmm.
with a combination of carrots and sticks, I think it's forcing companies, not just companies that are selling products, but also companies that are deep in the supply chains. Right? If you look at what's happening in the automotive space, I think there is more activity in sustainability that is happening in the tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers than we actually see sometimes with OEMs.
Yeah.
Right? And this is a massive, I would say, secondary effect that we didn't initially consider, but I think it's one of these big effects that we did not see before, I would say.
Yeah, that's interesting. We definitely see that as well. Like we've had interesting, conversations with Chinese companies on German pieces of legislation because German customers are asking or holding them to the same standards as they're being held in Germany, right? So there's
Yes.
definitely, very interesting examples of legislation rippling through the supply chain. And for me, you know, honestly, legislation has had a big effect in Europe. Like when we talk to American companies versus European companies, they're just miles behind on sustainability investments, a large part due to the legislatory environment, in my opinion, because we end up a little bit with the tragedy of the commons, right? Like we all know sustainability, we need to do something about it. We've seen the studies that probably some consumers will, charge more for it, et cetera, et cetera. But to really kind of make it a burning platform, you kind of gotta slap a fine at someone if they don't do it, right?
I don't think so. We do 70% of our business at Makersite in the US.
Ah, really? Interesting.
We do more business in the US than we do in Europe. And it's primarily because sustainability makes sense,
Okay.
business sense. And it's Americans are, they're a bunch of dreamers, right? So they're if they see an opportunity
Mm-hmm.
to drive business, they will take it. And
Mm-hmm.
right now, sustainability just makes a lot of sense for the reasons I described. But I think from the perspective of would customers be willing to pay more? I think these questions are not even they're not even asked when you're looking at business decisions, right? Because it's still you don't know. As a
Mm-hmm.
company, you don't know. Yes, I've seen some data, but what about me? You still have this problem. I think the question they ask themselves is the other way around. What would I lose? So a lot of the business that is driven by us today is this fear of loss. We had a customer that lost hundreds of millions of euros in 2022 because they just couldn't sell their product. They could not
Wow.
demonstrate environmental performance of their products. Their competition could. And so they had to do something about it. And I think this is, if you look at it from a consumer standpoint, just think of it differently. Regulations principally, they're not telling you to do anything, right? None of
Mm-hmm.
the regulations that we see right now are about directing you to take action. All that they say is you need to disclose what you're doing or not doing.
Mm-hmm.
And now think about this. If you lived in a glass house, you would behave very differently, wouldn't you? And that's what regulations are doing. So if I were forced to put a label on my laptop saying, this was built with child labor, would you buy that as a consumer? No. And I think this is what companies are scared of, that
Yeah.
these regulations if you look at what happened, I think this was in April, we approved the European product sustainability product regulator, ESPA, it's the digital product passport, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was passed by the European Parliament, which principally the goal is to put labels on all products that we buy in Europe. Just like if you look at what happened with nutrition labels, just by putting that information out, there was an entire mindset that changed around food, right? And how we eat food. And nobody cared about what is the vitamin content of food or fat content of food before we had nutrition labels. And I think this is what everybody is nervous about. As soon as you start putting a label on stuff, people start caring more and more about it and influence their decisions more and more about it. And even the mindset of it changes just by
Mm-hmm.
making things evident.
Okay, I like that comparison. I like the comparison with the nutrition labels. I've never thought about that. And maybe that kind of extends into a follow-up question here. And maybe I'm arguing a little bit against myself, but let's try anyways. One of the things I'm struggling with sometimes with consumer communication of sustainability is that sustainability is not a thing, right? Like it's a composition of, anything from, you mentioned child labor to product carbon footprint, etc. So it's many, many different topics rolled into one umbrella. It's very, very complex, and we try to boil it down to a label, right? That's why ESG ratings get so much critique, right? Because, how can you compare it, different methodologies when you're trying to, compare a billion different things. So when we then go to the consumer needs a simple format of communication, right? Something that they can quickly absorb. How does that play together with sustainability? Like, are we able to boil all of that complexity down into something that's easily accessible for the consumer? How do you think about that?
I think this is not a new problem, right? If you look at financial metrics and how we evaluate companies, there are experts that will look at 400, 500 KPIs about a
Mm-hmm.
company to know if they should invest in it or not. And there are others that will look at what is the bad news about that company
Mm-hmm.
for me not to invest in it. And I think this is the approach for sustainability as well. There was actually a study done in 2016, if I'm not mistaken, where they asked consumers, hey, would you like to see all of this sustainability information somewhere about a company. And back then it wasn't about product, it was actually about the company, right? So it was the entire GRI report or something like that. Would you like this to be public? And they were like, no, because we would not be able to make a decision based on it. We want the brand to make sure that there is nothing bad that they're doing. If we hear something bad, we will make a different choice. And I think this is the way for us as well. I think there is right now we have, I think, 400 different labels in Europe, just environmental labels, right, on products. I think it's a bit much, but I think this simplification where there's a certain standard that you need to meet, and if you don't meet that standard, then you don't play the game. I think this is an approach that needs to continue. I think you cannot do one or the other, right? It's just like your messaging is different for different customers. The amount of information and the kind of information you disclose to different people needs to also be different. I think transparency is the basis of it. So we need to know how the sausage is built, what was behind that label that you got. But we also need trustful labels where we can say, there are many, I don't want to take names, but there are many labels that actually imbue a sense of trust in the companies that are certified against that. And I think that's, I would look at it as two pathways that companies need to and have to take.
Yeah. And I think those might be a little bit related, because one of the problems with certifications and labels, especially when they're binary, is that the whole business model is structured around a company obtaining that certification or label. So if you set the bar too high and it's binary, you don't have a business, right? It's not going to run. If you set the bar too low, you don't have a label, right? But you're kind of adjusting to a very low common denominator where enough can kind of get across that bar. So if we're just making it binary, like nothing bad has had to happen, then the bar is pretty low. Like ideally, if we really want to optimize for impact, we need more nuance in that, right? We need to make it kind of quantified somehow, so you can see, okay, we have two companies here, they both have the label. This one, has a lower calorie footprint, for example, if we compare with the ingredients than the other one.
You need to be able to see that detail, because an expert like you and an expert like me will actually look for that detail to say, hey, if I want to compare two companies, I'm not just going to look if neither of them have child labor, or if there's more things that we will look at. And I think it's at the end of the day, you have to write the recipe for a cake, but not everybody that eats the cake is going to read the recipe. I think that's the way to look at it.
Got it. Okay. So tell me a little bit about Makersite. Like, you guys come in to essentially help companies build these product declarations behind the product sustainability footprint, or how do you guys come into play specifically?
Good question. The model for Makersite is helping companies make better products faster, right? And the approach to that is to construct digital twins of products. Think of it as a model of every single step of the manufacturing process of making a product, and doing this for every product that a company makes, and doing this at a granular level and a transparent level, and then using this model to understand environmental impacts, costs, regulations, regulatory impacts, safety implications of product design and supply chain design, and how to make these things better. The real problem that we solve is, if you want to understand a product, and I give you an example, think of a car, right? 70% of a car is outsourced on average. An OEM will principally just put 30% of that, all of these little pieces together, and 30% they'll make it themselves. So that means 70% of the data you need to understand what is the implication of a product choice or a design choice is not in your company. It's sitting in the supply chain. Now this car is made, and it accounts for 15% of the impact over its life cycle. The remaining is its use and end of life, right? I'm talking of an internal combustion engine. These numbers switch around if you're looking at an electric car, but it doesn't matter, right? These numbers will be more upstream heavy for an EV and have lower impact in its use. But just stick with me for a second. So now we've shipped this car out, and this car, if I drive it in Germany will have a different impact than if I drive it in the mountains somewhere in the Alps, right? Because per kilometer, you have more amount of fuel that you need to burn, as an example. Different cars may have different lifetimes in these situations. So this information also doesn't sit inside of a company. The end of life, depending on where you are using this car, what happens to it at its end of life is very different in every country. This information is not being kept within any of the ERP systems or PLM systems. So one of the big things that Makersite solves is how do you pull this information that sits outside in the world and connect it to the product that you're designing so you can understand what the implication is. And I think the outcome of that is you can do product declarations, you can do eco-design, you can do compliance analysis, you can do cost analysis of your product. Can you make it cheaper? Is there an implication of rerouting my supply chain from China or Australia to closer home, right? What is the implication of that? These digital twins help companies answer these questions. The reporting is just a side effect of it.
Yeah. Got it. Okay, let's talk through that a little bit because I'm curious about a bunch of things. Let's start with like the sourcing angle. You mentioned localization, right? That's one kind of lever to pull, I guess. I guess other levers could be like alternative materials or something like that. Help us think through a little bit. If you're designing a product for sustainability, what levers can you pull?
There's typically three things that you can do macroscopically, right? So big buckets. The first is material changes. There's different things under material changes. You can use materials that have more recycled content. You can have alternative materials that have the same physiochemical properties. So you use one. In the first example, you take primary plastic replace it with secondary plastic. You can't do this all the time, but it's possible in many cases. Or you're looking at higher recycled content for metals like aluminum and steel and so on and so forth, right? This is one big thing. So material choices are a big driver, and I think there are many cases where material switches are possible, but in many cases you want to keep the same material, but just increase the amount of recycled content that you have in it. Right.
Okay.
That kind of alleviates the costs of new homologations or new compliance certifications and so on and so forth. New testing that you need to do to see, hey, is it going to change the performance of my final product or not? The second is manufacturing processes, and this is more important downstream, so more complicated products than upstream. And the reason for that is, if you are making steel, the biggest driver of impact is actually the energy you use, right? So energy efficiency becomes the primary play. The more downstream you get, yield is more important because all of the impact has already been accumulated upstream. So the less of the material you waste, the better the outcome that you have for optimization, right? So the manufacturing process that you use is a very significant driver, not just from an energy efficiency perspective, but more specifically from a yield perspective. And you have different kinds of, instead of additive manufacturing techniques that have been employed in many cases. But even in terms of do you stamp it or do you machine it? Right. These kind of choices become very, very important. They also make business sense, right?
That's the thing with a lot of sustainability in your processes, right? Like a lot of it is just back to efficiency, and efficiency is a cost measure. It's a sustainability measure.
Yes. And the third big driver is supply chains, right? Rejigging supply chains. If you think about it, the difference between primary aluminum and the most sustainable aluminum you can buy today is 80%. The same manufacturing process, just localized to a country where you use more green electricity to make it versus one where you use coal. 80% difference, right? And many procurement people don't understand this. They don't understand the impact of it. That just adding to this, if you look at variability of aluminum, prices around the world vary by 40% maximum. But your leverage for impact is 80%. That's huge arbitrage in the middle, right? If you find the right supply from the right location, for the grade that you're looking for, this is massive impact that you can have. And I think this is the third very important thing. I think very often you can't switch suppliers. There are certain supply chains in the pharmaceutical space, aerospace, defense, even in automotive. It is, for certain components, it's very hard to do because you need to re-homologate and stuff like that. And so very often you work with suppliers for them to green their manufacturing process, and they do the same thing after that, right? And you kind of outsource the responsibility of decarbonization to your supplier in this way. But I think this is also, it falls into that bucket of pushing this up into the supply chain.
Got it. Okay. So there's two things I want to deep dive on there. So one is, the whole localization topic. There's been a lot of articles talking about, and challenging whether localization is actually more sustainable for a variety of different reasons. You have the social sustainability angle as well, right? I guess when you're talking about kind of moving, let's say, steel manufacturing to places where there's more green energy, there's probably a likelihood that you will be then moving it to countries, I don't know, like Norway, where you have a lot of, hydro energy and stuff like that. Does that then have unintended consequences socially? Are you moving it away from high poverty countries where you maybe want to keep working and so on? Tell me a little bit about kind of that angle to localization.
I think there is, so in my 20 years, I've worked with over 250 companies, and different products, right, from yogurt to fruit to rocket ships. There is no
between fruit and rocket ships.
Yes. And the problems are very different too, right? Okay. So this is the challenge you have is there's no such thing as a perfect product, because there's no such thing as a perfect customer, and there's no such thing as a perfect infrastructure to make and sell my product and use my product, right? You have to look at this from the perspective that it is always a trade-off that you need to make, both upstream, but also in the design and the use of your product. The way I would make a yogurt jar in Germany is very different from the way I would make it for Italy or India, as an example, right? Because that situation is different. And I think if you expand this to economic, to social considerations, it is a trade-off at the end. I think one needs to, you cannot optimize for all three and get positive outcomes on all three. There is always, I've seen in my experience, there is one thing that you prioritize more than the other. And this is, I think, a business decision. We do this all the time, right? If I make products that are mass market products, imagine if I were to tell you that that toothpaste suddenly became, okay, toothpaste is a special case because we don't want harmful substances in our toothpaste, right? But imagine if I told you that all toothpaste is now going to cost 5 times more. Every brand, every single toothpaste is going to cost you 5 times more. That's a problem, right? There may be products that where the target market is willing to assimilate higher costs, or I would say not always cost, but even performance, right? If you look at an aeroplane, right, it's amazing. The interior of an aircraft, every single part is designed for an impact of 9 Gs. So it needs to stay there and withstand an impact of 9 Gs.
Wow.
If you were to have an impact of 9 Gs, you'd be, there's bigger problems to solve, right? It's in an aircraft. And I think sometimes it may be smarter to say, hey, a 3G impact for a galley, right, or the trolley that you move down the island in an aircraft is enough. Or that the separator that you have between the first class and the second class, right? That's 9 Gs. Why do we need that? There's these considerations where you may be willing to make a trade-off on performance to to relieve the environmental impact or to have a better impact from a social perspective. But I think these are decisions that companies will make based on what they're really good at and what their product is.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think you can prescribe anything. I give you an example, right? So there's entire things, I won't name them, but there's beverage producers that went to South India
Mm-hmm.
and did a great job. I mean, it created new jobs and it raised the economic level of an entire region in southern India.
Wow.
But what happened was they extracted all of their groundwater and got sued at the end, right? Because at the end of the day, they're farmers. So you were helping one group of people, but then you were hurting farmers who couldn't have access to water to grow their crops. And this is a problem. This is a trade-off that you make. So what is good and what is bad, right? I think this is where there are certain regulations where we say you can't do harm,
Mm-hmm.
and then businesses need to decide how to optimize for maximum value.
Mm-hmm. Okay. No, I fully agree with you, Neil. It's the devil's really in the details, isn't it? It's hard to say, localization is good, localization is bad. It's all
Yes.
dependent.
Yes.
Like any good consultant, the answer is, well, it depends.
That's one thing I hate about consultants, right? It depends, because it's a very self-aggrandizing approach to things. You need me
Yes.
to give you this answer because it always depends. I don't think so. I think as long as you decide the circumstances, the reality, there is always a unique, unambiguous answer to that question. It doesn't have to depend. It only depends when the scenario that you're using, right? Plastics, for example. There's huge studies that have been done for the last 15 years. Should we have single-use plastic for shopping bags, for example?
Mm-hmm.
And the answer of every study is it depends. But if you actually read into the study, it doesn't depend. For southern Germany, there is an answer that is unambiguous.
Okay.
You should use one thing. For Copenhagen, there's another answer that is unambiguous that you should use. It's just we try to overgeneralize, and when you overgeneralize, then of course it depends. And I think businesses need to stop this overgeneralizing, right? We are becoming more and more customer centric, where there's more and more customizations of our products, more and more varieties of our products. Why are we trying to generalize everything else then? Be specific about exactly these situations as well. If I'm designing a yogurt jar for Sri Lanka, then please understand what is the collection rates in Sri Lanka, what is the behavior of use in Sri Lanka, and then design your jar. Don't design a German jar and try and sell it to Sri Lanka. That's when it always depends, and it overcomplicates things. Just defining the problem properly simplifies the answer.
I like that. But you will end up in situations where you have this poor, sustainable supply chain professional that manages 30,000 suppliers, right?
Yes.
Like, they're going to need some sort of generalization. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to look into the nuances of every single scenario.
Well, and this is where I think this is the thinking of the past, right? My approach to this and my philosophy here is procurement is very good at making decisions based on cost, quality, performance, right? So deliverability, I would say. Usually you could just summarize this as cost and quality. There's numbers, they have tools, they know how to separate suppliers in this way. Why can't you add another number for carbon? Mm-hmm. Why can't you add another number for socioeconomic impact? Just add these as numbers. They know how to use this. Same with engineers, right? Engineers work with tons of information when they're trying to design products, simulation data, CAD data, and so on and so forth. Just add sustainability data to it. They know how to use it. We don't need to create a new process or new systems for them to do their job. They already know. What we need to do is put sustainability into their systems to make better decisions. And it has worked. There are companies that have done this and have shown tremendous amount of success. We have a customer called Microsoft. I think they're fairly public, so I can speak about it. But they've worked with us for 2 years, and they managed to build, I would say, one of the most sustainable laptops in the world.
Okay.
They reduce the impact across the entire value chain by almost 30%. And that is amazing, right? That's not just by buying green electricity or offsetting their impact. This is real redesign of product and supply chain that they managed to do this. We have another company called Paka, which is now part of Lipton, where they removed 70% of the impact from their packaging through design. And I think this is extremely heartening, and it comes from exactly that. How can you put the power of data in the hands of the people that already know how to use it?
Yeah, I like that. Okay, so you mentioned earlier, and now you mentioned it with Microsoft as well, throughout the supply chain. You have your direct suppliers, and then something happens
Yes.
beyond those suppliers, right? How in the world do you deal with that? There are solutions out there. We discussed blockchain 5 years ago as that would be the magic solution to this. I think you can argue if that's correct. I don't think that's a magic bullet in my opinion. So I'd love to hear your perspective on it. Like, how do you go past your first tier of suppliers and scalably work all the way back to the source?
I would say, how do you even go back to your tier one supplier and ask the right question? Right?
Yeah, but tier one is easier, right? Because you have like the contact and you know about them and what you're buying and so on. But as soon as you go beyond that, you lose visibility, right?
I'm gonna make it worse for you. You're right and wrong there, right? If I go to a company that makes high tech products, and this is my supplier, right? And I say, tell me what's in that product. 10 times out of 10, you will not get an answer. Why? It's because this is my IP. I don't want to tell it to you. So forget about tier 2 and tier 3, right? Tier 1 is already a very big problem for many, many companies. If you're looking at steel, yes, basic materials where the IP of the company is not embedded in the product, but is in how they run their business, right? Totally simple, right? And even there, they will never tell you what is the energy efficiency of some of their processes, right? Because that's where, same with chemicals and so on and so forth. So chemicals is notorious. Nobody wants to tell you what the formulation of their product is, obviously, because then anybody could make it, right? So I think it is a consequence of this globalized supply chain that we built for ourselves, that we are incentivized not to share this kind of information. I think I've been in the space for 15 years where we built these kind of systems, and they invariably do not work. Not even at tier 1, forget about tier 2 and tier 3. And you could either sit and whine about it. You could set up industry platforms. I think there are certain industries that have started doing this. The chemical sector with Together for Sustainability, automotive with IMDS in the past, and now there is Katina X. There are programs that industries have got together and said, hey, we need to change this. We need a way to develop and share this kind of information through deep tiers. But there is nothing. All of these systems are empty today. So they're nice technology, but there's no data in them.
Exactly.
Because it's still the fundamental problem has not changed. And this is where Makersite took a totally different approach. So we didn't wait. We didn't wait for the world to change. We didn't wait for industry associations to come together and create platforms that generate this data. We said there is already data that's available.
Okay.
I mean, just think about it, right? Every company is selling a product. This information is public. Everybody is trying to tell you what product they're selling. What we haven't done is connected what a person is selling to who's buying it. Right? That's the big conundrum that we have. There is lots of information about this product when you are selling it. So if you look at the compliance world, REACH, that is now I think almost 20 years old, is a regulation in Europe which principally said if you're putting certain harmful substances into your product, you need to disclose that. What if you were to use that to figure out what's in products that are being sold into the European Union? It's about reverse engineering, reapplying data that already exists. There have been platforms in the textile space that have been surveying suppliers for 25 years or 30 years now, very long time, right? Can you leverage that information to uncover what's happening in the supply chain and what the impact is? And this is a bit of the secret sauce of Makersite. We've looked at databases and programs that have been run for decades where there is already information that was not really designed for what we want to use it. But if you stick it together in the right way, you can uncover a lot of this puzzle. And this is I think this is one of the, it's an intermediate step, right? It allows us to make good enough decisions today while still running in this world of ambiguity, where I don't think we will ever get to a situation where we know 100% of what's happening in tier 7.
Yeah.
I'm not even sure it's necessary to do that, because if you look at it, tier 2, tier 3, this is where most of the impacts will happen, and then they kind of subside as you go further up the supply chain. So there's certain supply chains that you really need to be very accurate about, and I think we're getting better and better there. And there are some that you just have to say, it's good enough for Jazz. We can make decisions based on it. I think what you have to also think about is there is no final product. Every tier 1 supplier is somebody's customer. And there's bits and pieces of this information that become available as you go to different sectors and different tiers of supply chains. I think to date, we have not really seen any supply chain where we are completely blind.
And that's by tapping into existing data?
Exactly. Not within a company, but data from, you have data aggregators, you have industry platforms, you have regulatory platforms. I don't know if you know, but there's a European pollution registry. It covers, so above a certain manufacturing threshold, every manufacturing facility across Europe needs to report on pollution that they emit into water streams and into the environment. Did you know that?
Nope.
That is massive amounts of granular site-based data. It's available. We use it. Nobody else is using it until now. And I think this is immensely valuable information that's just spread out everywhere. There's catalog information. So there's aggregators, right, of data that principally the goal of it was, we want to be the window, the menu card, right? So it's the Amazon of the world. We'll pull together information so that a customer could come in and look at our platform and find all of the materials that are potentially being sold. So you actually have manufacturers who are paying these kind of companies to put their information into these kind of platforms. There's tremendous amounts of data that's available there. You just need to repurpose it to understand how supply chains are working and what the potential impact is. And you put different pieces of information together that singularly would never solve the problem of transparency or give you the answer you're looking for. But as soon as you put them together, you construct what you're looking for.
So I think I agree and disagree, right? I think, again, the big problem is, and you kind of said it spot on, right? Like, you can design these systems very easily, whether you put them in a blockchain or not. That's really, it almost doesn't matter. And you can create industry initiatives, but, how do you get the data into it in the first place? And then there are some databases, like there are trading databases where you log whenever somebody exports something, who's the receiver, who's the sender, those kind of things. That's great. That can help me get some sort of indication, right? But that's it, I guess.
Yes and no. So we managed to create, at Makersite, we've created the world's largest supply chain database. It covers about 35% of global supply chains. And we do this at a unit process level. So that is, think of making your t-shirt, right? So stitching of that t-shirt is one step of the unit process. Creating the fabric is another step of that unit process. And in this way, we've covered about 35% of all the processes. If you really, I want to tell you something really, really shocking. Would you believe me if I told you that everything you see in the world around you is made from 1,000 manufacturing processes?
That sounds small, doesn't it?
Yes, that's it.
Wow.
It's not, there's different very complicated machines and all of that stuff, right? But CNC machining is a kind of process. It will always, for a single product, will have the same amount of yield, plus minus. If you can understand how this is used and where it is used, you can uncover a lot. Right? This is just an example of it, right? The world is actually less complex than we think. It is very, very complicated. I mean, Makersite is a massive system, but if you really break it down to small pieces, you start to see things in a much more simpler way. And I think there are certain questions, and I want to be open about that as well, because the scrutiny is correct. I will never be able to tell you this is your supplier in tier 4. I can't, not without your help, right? It is a lot of effort. It's a slog to get there.
Yeah.
But I'll be able to tell you, hey, you have, I don't know, nickel that is coming in through a particular component in your tier 4 supply chain. And this nickel is probably coming from these regions, and there is a potential risk associated with it.
Got it.
That is extremely valuable, because you can answer things about environmental impact, you can answer things about compliance, you can answer things about risk and social impact. You can answer many of these questions. All that I can't do is, hey, there's a certain plant that went on fire. Is that somewhere in my tier 7? Is there a reason? I mean, is there a purpose to answer that in the first place? During COVID, we worked with many companies where they were trying to figure out exactly that. And the first question I'd ask them is, okay, so let's assume I tell you who that supplier is that's at risk. What are you going to do about it? There's nothing you can do about it. You have no business relationship with them, right? Even for tier 1 suppliers, typically what will happen is if there's a shortage of material in one place about a particular part, it's usually the supply chains will kneel themselves to bridge that gap. And if they can't bridge that gap, there is no other place to secure supply of that particular material. You have to do a redesign in that case. So knowing who that supplier is doesn't help you anyways, right? So there's certain questions that, yes, you may want to have answered, but you have to just ask the question: is it relevant to answer that question? Does it add value? And I think this is how you can minimize, you can reduce the problem that you're trying to define and solve.
Awesome. Look, I love that, Neil. I really like the pragmatic. So even if you knew what are you going to do about it, right? Like, it's not even your control. So why do you want to know, right?
Yep.
Okay, we're almost out of time, Neil. There's one last thing I want to pick your brain on. So we talked a lot about upstream, right? We haven't talked a lot about downstream. So you're designing a product. What can you do to reduce that kind of end of life component?
Yeah, design for context. I think this is in one sentence. It would be design for context. You need to understand how your product is going to be used, and there are certain things that are energy-consuming products, right? Cars, laptops, these kind of things. There's passive products, right, where you could look at a screw that you put into a wall, or a table. Right. These are what you call passive products. Even a shirt actually is an active product,
Okay.
because it needs to be washed, right? And that takes water and energy and so on. There's not much you can do in that, but imagine if your shirt could be washed at lower temperature, right? Through certain materials that you could put that are more stain resistant and so on and so forth. These are kind of things that you want to look at. Know what your product is, and then design for the context of use. So if I'm selling it in a certain market where for example, electricity is greener, then I would want to make my product consume electricity rather than fossil fuel, right? As opposed to another region where there is no access to the grid, then there's no other option that you have. I think these, in the context of recycled content, right? This is another. I've had so many conversations around this. There are certain countries, and everybody is trying to move towards recycling and repurposing capabilities, right? Or even if it's incineration, right? This is also a kind of repurposing. Very often you will find that it's actually, from an environmental perspective, better to just incinerate a plastic rather than try to clean it and speciate it and then repurpose it or recycle it into a secondary plastic that does not have the same physiochemical properties as primary. So I think designing in the context of how advanced is the material you're using and how advanced is the market that you are selling this product into. If there's no collection facilities, it will end up in landfill. Then please don't make this with highly expensive packaging, even if it is going, highly recyclable. No point you're using a recyclable material in a country where you cannot recycle it. It will not even be collected. And I think this is this design in context. I think this is super important. And I think it is something that we don't do enough, I would say. Because if you look at the world of engineering, right, it is always about it. At the end of the day, just physically representation, it's CAD, right? It's the physical product that I've designed. But its implication in use and end of life, you have simulation systems that will say, hey, if I ram this car against a wall, what will happen to it, right? This is all great. But putting this in the context of where this car will be used, how will it be recycled? These are things that we do not have. Our simulation tools don't do today, and I think we need to fix that, and we're in the business of fixing that.
Amazing, Neil. I love the engineer's perspective on these problems. That's fascinating. With that in mind, any last words you want to leave the listeners with that are maybe just about to get started on these supply chain sustainability problems?
I think the one advice I would give you is there is tons of information there. There is tons of approaches there. There's tons of technologies there, and there's tons of vendors there. I think one of the first things you need to do, and this is why much of reporting standards actually prescribe this, is materiality, right? Figure out what is material to your company and what do you want to fix. Right? Very often you may not know what you need to fix, and then you need to find out. But I think defining that scope, like I described earlier in this conversation, defining that scope will simplify your problem. If you try to do everything, I will report to GRI and I will report to CDP and I will do an SBTI and I will do this and I will do that. Yes, you will do a lot of reporting, you will do a lot of data collection and not a lot of change. Right? So focus, I think, define this, and I think it's not something that I could come into a company and on day one say, these are the 3 things you need to do. Yes, I could provide some insight based on my experience and industry experience, but very often, even 2 car companies, I mean, why do we have multiple car companies? They are specific, they are special in their own way. They build their own kind of product, and therefore they are their own kind of company. And therefore, the things that you will use, the weightings that you will use to trade off, what is more important to them, they need to define that. And that's what will be that will get them to the solution part much faster. If you think of, in the last 20 years, what I've noticed, there are companies that made very big claims, broad claims, and they spent an extremely long period of time just collecting data, just analyzing data, because you spend all of your time trying to answer all the questions, many of which are not relevant. Like we talked about with, what would you know if you knew what your tier 4 supplier was? What would you do about it? I think defining that problem specific to your company and in context of what your company is really good at will solve a lot of your problems, get you to the solution faster.
I love it, Neil. That's great. Very pragmatic advice here to end on. Neil, this was fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on Next Frontier.
It was a pleasure, Thomas. I enjoyed the conversation too.
Likewise. If you're still here, then first of all, thank you so much for listening. If you've got thoughts about this episode or what you'd like to hear more of, you can email us at thomas@nextfrontier.earth. We really do read every email. You can also hit me up directly on LinkedIn. Just search for Thomas Buch Andersen. That's Thomas B-U-C-H Andersen. If you feel like it, please share with your friends and subscribe wherever you listen to our podcast. We also have a YouTube channel. It's on @NextFrontierEarth if you want to see what we actually look like in person. And if you really love the show, hit us with that 5-star review. Today's episode was produced and edited by Christina Soto, and Next Frontier music is by Keyhole. See you next time.